Welcome, I'm Louis Meyers, and this is Meet the Author. And today I am just so honored to have as our guest Mr. Nicholas Kristof. Any of you who read the New York Times certainly will know Mr. Kristof and his work, but I'm going to briefly introduce him now. We have so much to talk about, including this remarkable book that he wrote, Chasing Hope. Mr. Kristof is on with us from your home in New York.
Home in Yamhill, Oregon.
Oh, you're
In the
back in
wild
Oregon.
Yamhill,
Wonderful,
Oregon.
wonderful. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. Mr. Kristof is a winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's a longtime reporter and weekly op-ed columnist for the New York Times. He was raised in rural Oregon in Yamhill. He graduated from Harvard University. He was a Rhodes Scholar, got a master's degree in art from Oxford. He worked as a business correspondent before moving on to his long career as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He has visited 140 countries and counting. He has been a bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He did run for the governor of Oregon in 2021. We'll talk about that. I would say, Mr. Kristof, that I read this book last year, and 2 weeks ago I began to sit down and sort of review it, thinking I'd just hit the highlights, and I found that every page there was a highlight. I had to reread the whole book again, and it was just as good the second time. I do know it's just come out in paperback, and this is a book that I hope all of our listeners will have a chance to read. It is just a tremendous work, and of course your career is ongoing. I thought we
Well,
would...
thank you. And I'm delighted to be with you. And but please call me Nick because I'm aging. I'm graying every time I get called Mr.
Well,
Kristof.
I'll try and do that. There's so much to talk about here. I thought we would just start at the beginning, your origin story, as it were. Both you talk in the book, the beginning part of the book, about your parents, and also about Yamhill, Oregon, and the rural area of Oregon that you grew up in. Can you tell us a little bit about them and there?
Yeah. I mean, my dad was a World War II refugee. His family was Armenians, and they had spied on the Nazis. They got caught in 1943. Some were executed by the Nazis, others executed by the Soviet communists. And my dad fled to Yugoslavia, was at a concentration camp at an asbestos mine. In 1952, was sponsored by a family in Portland, Oregon, to come to the U.S. And I do think that experience of his, in some way shapes my own interest in human rights. And also, I think it taught me that you don't have to solve a problem in its entirety to make a difference. You know, when this family sponsored my dad to the U.S. in 1952, it didn't solve the refugee problem, but it sure made a difference for the Kristofs.
And so the Kristof settled in this very rural area of Oregon. You were a farm kid. Tell us, what was it life like back then?
So, at that point, Lewis, it really was an area full of upward mobility. And there was not a lot of focus on education, which in retrospect was a huge mistake for the community. But there were good jobs in the mills, in the local factories. The biggest employer was a glove factory in the area. And so people had enjoyed real upward mobility. The family that got on the kids who got on the school bus right after me each morning were the 5 Knapp kids. Farland Knapp was my year in school. Then his brother Zeeland, his brother Nathan, their sister Regina, and the baby brother Keelan. And, their dad had a blue collar union job laying sewer pipe. Their mom had a job driving a tractor on a local farm, but they had parlayed that into being able to buy their own house, into living, a pretty decent life. And so when Farland turned 16, his family got him a Ford Mustang, and I was so jealous of Farland. But as the book chronicles, those jobs went away, and meth arrived. Actually, Farland was one of the first people to cook meth in this area. Um, and I think of that he would have been a great pharmacist or great chemist because apparently he made really good meth. But instead he was producing drugs, and he died as a result. So did each of his siblings. Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And Keelan died of a fentanyl overdose. And, you know, their mom is still alive in her 80s and walks up the hill every day to visit the graves of her 5 dead children. And
It's an American tragedy.
yeah, and I felt like, you know, in my career, I was going from covering humanitarian crises abroad to finding one right here at home in a place that I loved and cherished.
Yeah. Well, your own household was different. Your father was educated. He tried his hand at farming. I'm not sure it was entirely successful. There was a little bit of comedic breaks in there and talking about how the farm prospered or not did not. But you did very well in school, and you applied and were accepted to Harvard University. Now, I have to bring this up. You were an excellent student, and your test scores were amazing. You were every bit qualified to go to Harvard. In this day and age, you might have been considered a DEI student only because you were coming from a very rural area where not many Harvard students would typically come from. Tell us about what your experience was like coming to Harvard, and what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I totally think I was an affirmative action pick, and that, you know, nobody from my school had ever gone to any Ivy League institution. Harvard had no idea how to assess the grades or the recommendations from my school. You know, in any case, I arrived, and I was kind of overwhelmed by the background of so many students. I remember trying to chat up this girl, and I knew she spoke French, so in my really awful French, I tried to offer some, you know, some charm, and she immediately replied in this, you know, fast-paced French, and it turns out she'd gone to lycée in Manhattan, and, you know, her French was completely flawless, and I was utterly humiliated. And that was a little bit of the pattern of my freshman year, but I really, I mean, I loved the opportunity Harvard gave me. I worked a lot on a school paper, which was a fantastic educational experience, and in many ways sort of laid the groundwork for my eventual career.
Well, we know that Harvard, and we can talk about that later, we know that Harvard is obviously facing its challenges now because of having served and admitted students, brilliant students such as yourself. From Harvard, you went on to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and toyed, it sounds like from the book, with the idea of becoming a lawyer, but ultimately that didn't hold a tremendous amount of appeal for you. What was it like being over in Oxford?
This is going to sound like a bit of a slap at Oxford, but it isn't really. But so I was studying law. I really was, as you suggested, in some danger of becoming a lawyer. But the best thing about Oxford's undergraduate system, and law at that point was an undergraduate degree, so I was doing a second BA, it was that you studied for 8 weeks, and then you got 6 weeks vacation. 8 weeks study, 6 weeks vacation, 8 weeks study, and then is summer vacation. And so that was really when I began to travel the world with the Rhodes stipend. And I used those travels to then write for various publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Oregonian, the Observer. And I both fell in love with the writing part of it, but I also just saw, you know, the stakes of getting development and poverty and health right. And it's when you see the suffering in some of these places, it really kind of haunts you.
You know, it's interesting. Of course, Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar as well, and he had something of the same experience from what I've read. Used that time productively to travel around Europe and Asia and other places, and sort of opened his perspective. Of course, he came from a small town in Arkansas, so there are some similarities. You came back to the United States, and of course you had been on the Harvard Crimson, wrote for them, which is top university newspaper, but sounds like you were really geared toward journalism. when you came back to this country, and you had a job out in Los Angeles, I believe, as a business correspondent, and you basically knew nothing about business when you started. Is that correct?
That's basically right. The New York Times business editor hired me in 1984, and you know, the interview should have gone disastrously because I knew nothing at all about business. But fortunately, the business editor was a big Anglophile, and so we spent our whole interview talking about our various times in Britain. And he never really established that I was completely ignorant about business until after I was on staff covering business. Um, and so then they dispatched me to Los Angeles as a correspondent, and I figured business out occasionally at the expense of readers.
Some politician, I can't remember which, famously said the business of America is business. I'm not sure if that, I can't recall which person said that, but you did toy with possibly working at the Washington Post as well, but ultimately went to the New York Times, which has been your journalistic home for over 40 years. It's called the old, what is it, the Gray Lady, the old Gray Lady, thought to be, the finest newspaper in the world, perhaps. But what is it about the New York Times and its culture that has drew you and sustained you?
There is a enormous commitment to covering important things around the world that I admire, that I'm lucky to be a part of. And I mean, for a while during the Iraq War, every time we drove from the Baghdad airport to downtown Baghdad, it cost $10,000 in security because of the risk of being attacked. So $10,000 for a one-way drive from the airport to the city. And, readers weren't necessarily captivated by this. I don't know that that was a good financial investment in the coverage, but it was important to understand the world and what our soldiers were going through. And the Times unflinchingly covered that. They unflinchingly covered my trips to Darfur to cover the genocide there. I mean, there really is a commitment to getting the story. I think there's real integrity there. I mean, obviously, look, I'm biased, but I sure see that. And I think in recent years, I mean, over the last 15 years, there's also been this incredible success in developing a business model for this kind of journalism.
Yeah.
And there are 2.5 newspapers going out of business every week in the United States.
Yeah.
But the New York Times has figured out a business model in large part based on the internet, on circulation and getting people to subscribe and pay a fee for that. That has worked remarkably well and that pays for this kind of reporting. So I think both on the news side or news/opinion side and on the business side, it's truly a remarkable institution. And I think that maybe that has never been more true than at a time when I fear that our government has real authoritarian instincts and it's important to hold it accountable.
Sure. And foreign foreign bureaus have been cut back in most of the newspapers in this country and perhaps around the world. As part of you met your wife, Cheryl, your life partner, and you talk about her extensively in the book because she's a remarkable lady in her own right.
I married up.
Yeah. and the two of you began to visit these various countries, Japan, Beijing, Tokyo, and you raised your children overseas to some extent as well. You were in Beijing during the Tiananmen massacre, and I believe that was your first Pulitzer. Am I correct? Yeah.
That's right.
But the reporting on that and some of the other places you've been in your life is hard to read, but I think important. Tell us a little bit about what that was like to be in Tiananmen in 1989, June of 1989.
Well, Louis, I mean, in some ways, I look back on it with a certain amount of embarrassment because during the democracy movement, there in the spring of 1989, I wrote several times that in a somewhat condescending way toward the workers and peasants who were part of that. I wrote that, well, they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define the kind of democracy that they're for. They can't talk about the guardrails, the institutions that they would use to create that democracy. And that was all true. But then on the night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, when the army sent troops in to massacre the protesters, and I was in the middle of that crowd that they opened fire on. Some of the bravest people were precisely those workers and peasants. Um, one thing I'll never forget. There was a bus driver, the salt of the earth, poorly educated bus driver, who was on one of the roads leading to Tiananmen Square, and it was a two-lane road. He was ready to block the troops if they showed up, and sure enough, this huge convoy of soldiers comes down the road, barreling down the road to effectively massacre the students. This bus driver quickly parks his bus across the road to block them. He turns the engine off. He has the keys in his hand. It's at night, and the convoy comes to a halt. An officer orders him to move the bus. He refuses. The officer points a sidearm at him and says, "Move the bus." And the bus driver, he takes the keys and he just hurls them as far as he can into the high grass on the side of the road. And that guy might not have been able to define democracy, but he was willing to die for it. And I've often thought that in recent years, as democracy has been tested in this country, that we sometimes take democracy for granted precisely because we've inherited it, and that we could learn a good deal from those Chinese workers and peasants and students who valued democracy precisely because they'd endured life in an authoritarian system and saw its costs. I think we have a fair amount we could learn from them.
You were in the middle of that horrendous massacre. Bullets don't always differentiate between Chinese protesters and American journalists. And in fact, whether it's there or Darfur or various parts of Africa you've been in, you have had some very close calls. And you write about some of them. Some of them you've been able to use your own experience and wits to get out of. Some of it was just plain lucky. At what point, or did you ever experience PTSD? Can I ask that?
Yeah, and I think that I think it was really when writing Chasing Hope that I kind of became aware of it. And I sort of thought through some of my reactions and the way I'd been affected, and just this fear. To some degree, when you cover massacres and atrocities, you can put on this professional armor, and you go and you just want to get your interviews and get the story and then get out. But there are some things that armor can't protect you from, and one is, the fear that you face that you're going to be shot or you're going to be, beheaded. In one case where I came across a mob that was beheading people, and that fear it lives with you, and the fear of what you might do to your family if you don't come back. And also, I think often the kids just got to me that I could, I had my armor, but when you see a child that's been shot or is starving or whatever it may be, that gets to you. And war after war, massacre after massacre, gunman after gunman, it, I read somewhere that, when your gut clenches so much out of fear that sometimes it takes, it's hard to unclench. And I felt that myself to some degree. I was very lucky that I had this incredible loving family and supportive family. The Times has great resources. But I took up long distance backpacking in that period after the Darfur
And that's
genocide
one of the
with my
pictures on
kids.
the cover of the book, I believe. One
Yes,
of your
that's right.
backpacking
Um,
trips.
Best parenting I ever did was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail with my daughter, Mexico to Canada. And I think that, that was kind of wilderness therapy.
One of the real emotional challenges, too, and you write about frequently in the book, in those situations where people are starving or about to be massacred, is separating out your journalistic obligations versus just what you would do as a feeling, caring person. Can you save this person when thousands are being killed? And that is a moral injury, as it were. How did you deal with that?
I think my position changed to some degree over time, and that I came to think more and more that my fundamental responsibility is not to be a journalist watching from the sidelines, but to, is as a human who could try to do what he can to help others and save other lives. And I think maybe one moment, Louis, when it particularly became a test, was in China. There was a young man who had helped us cover democracy movement and the massacre. And then he ended up arrested.
Mm-hmm.
He escaped from prison and he came to Beijing and asked me for help fleeing the country. And there was a real collision between my journalistic values and my humanistic ones. It's pretty clear that a journalist should not be helping an escaped felon flee the country. But, here's a 19-year-old kid, university student, who was only in trouble because he had helped me win a Pulitzer for that matter, and helped New York Times readers understand what was going on. And so I agonized over that, but Cheryl and I decided to help him, and we were able to help him get out of the country. And he's now in the U.S. And it's a profoundly unprofessional thing, perhaps, but it's one that I'm proudest of.
And you've remained friends with him for all these decades. I made a note for myself when I was thinking about this interview. There's a movie, of course, The Year of Living Dangerously starred Mel Gibson, where he is a reporter as in Jakarta as the, I think it's Sukarno, or whichever dictator at the time was going to start massacring communists and would-be communists. Is that movie, what would you say about that movie? Give me a thumbnail sketch of review of that movie as a foreign correspondent yourself.
I mean, I think there was a lot to it, that you find yourself in these situations, you're overwhelmed, it's very hard to gauge risk. You see mass atrocities and you're outraged and you want to fight back. And the tools we have to fight back are well, these days it's, my laptop and my camera. Um, but the other thing that I think was very true is that you depend on local people.
Yeah.
That's your interpreter, that's a driver, and you have a certain amount of protection as a foreigner, as a guy with a blue passport. But the local people helping you, they're totally at risk. And I don't think we in journalism always do enough to protect those local people and to recognize that we're putting others at risk, and trying to manage that risk not only for ourselves but also for the local stringer, interpreter, driver, is something that I wrestle with in a lot of cases.
The other movie that came to my mind came out more recently, a few years ago, about, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on her name, but the wonderful reporter who was covering Syria and was tracked down and killed by Assad, and
Right.
along with her photographer, I believe, and interpreters. And in the movie gives an impression of a woman who was so driven that she did put herself in ultimately fatal danger along with people working with her. Did you see the movie, and what were your thoughts on that? Did you
I
know
did
her,
not
by the way?
see the movie. Part of it is that my wife and I we tend to see movies together, and the last thing I'm going to do
Yeah,
is, take my wife to see a movie about a journalist being killed.
good point.
Um,
Good point.
and but she was her heroic figure, and I mean it is. I mean, I think there is sometimes a problem that journalists can be addicted to not exactly the danger, but to the sense of taking on a brutal criminal regime and
Mhm.
to want to expose it and stop it. And I mean, nobody, imagined that the Assad regime was going to either figure out where those journalists were or then bomb the whole building
Yeah,
and kill a number of journalists in that one bombing.
yeah. You did take a change of course, as I mentioned. Of course, COVID came in 2020, and you were out in Oregon, and you decided to run for governor, which was a big step, and that was in 2021. You were going to run in the Democratic primary, and you write about that in the book. But tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I was just particularly upset at the state that I love, and part of that was just seeing what had happened to the kids on my old school bus. A third of whom are now gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, and a feeling that my world of liberals hadn't always done enough to help working class Americans. Uh, either with education, with job opportunities, and so on. And I'd also always, encourage other people to get engaged in politics and civic life. And so when some people came to me and suggested this, I thought, well, you know, maybe I should listen to myself. I must say that it was sort of fascinating because I've been politics adjacent for my whole career, and all of a sudden being on the other side of it was so different. Um, and um, I mean, my team, I had a great team, and my team
Yeah,
thought, well, okay, Kristof doesn't, he doesn't know a lot of the local players. He doesn't know a lot about the the what's going on in the Oregon legislature. But the one thing he'll be really good at is press conferences. And it turned out the one thing I kind of blew
yeah,
was press conferences, largely because I would answer reporters' questions.
yeah. You were too
And my
honest.
team was like, what? You're supposed to answer the question you wish you were asked, not the one you were asked. And so they probably gave me a lot of solid training on evasion.
Well, yeah, it's kind of depressing, that part of the book, because you realize, to what extent you had to reprogram yourself, at least temporarily, and what our politics is like. You talk about the huge impact of money and raising money and how it affected your campaign and what you had to do to run a viable campaign, even in a relatively low media market state like Oregon.
Yeah. I mean, the paradox was this was an advantage for me because, in general, political candidates in Oregon, I mean, there are not a lot of really wealthy people here. And so there tends to be kind of less money spent on campaigns than in a lot of places. Whereas I had this national network of people who were eager to support me. I quickly raised more than any other Democrat running. But, but it felt, yeah, I mean, it just felt profoundly wrong and abusive of the entire electoral system. And it was also just a painful way to spend time to have this call list,
Yeah,
and be calling people one person after another, asking them to donate money. Oregon had no limit on campaign donations, which was also pretty ridiculous. And, their upshot is that you're listening to and engaging with very wealthy donors and reflecting their concerns rather than, the kind of people who were on my old school bus and were dying.
yeah. It came to an anticlimactic end because I think it was the election commissioner, uh, who had some tie-ins to the various politicos in the state, ruled that somehow you had not met the residency requirements. That was debatable. It went to the Supreme Court. She was later had her own legal issues, as you note. I just want to read a quote from a New York Times editor, which is in the book, when you were running for office. It said, Nick has a remarkable talent for never taking anything personally, for never letting ego get in his way. At a place as competitive as the New York Times, this trait really stood out. He somehow seemed like this innocent, unchanged after dining with warlords or interviewing pimps. This will serve him well in politics. I thought
all those dinners with warlords and pimps. Yeah.
Yes.
Look, in journalism, we dish it out. I think we have to be willing to take it. And also, I think, one thing that we learn in journalism is how often we are wrong. And that does require a certain amount of humility. I think about the great issues of the 20th century, and a good chunk of the left was wrong about the central foreign policy issue, which was totalitarianism. And there were, way too many on the left who were soft toward Soviet communism and soft toward Maoist communism. Meanwhile, the great domestic issue of the 20th century in the US was civil rights. And there were far too many on the right who got that wrong. So both left and right have plenty of reason to not just point fingers at the other, but to look in the mirror and to acknowledge that, we've all screwed up, and it does help to listen to those criticisms.
You have a bust of Robert Kennedy behind your shoulder there that I think viewers can see, and we talked briefly before we went on the air about that. You said he was an inspiration for you. Who are some of the other prominent public figures that you've respected, admired, even if you didn't necessarily agree with all of their policies?
Jimmy Carter was somebody I thought was hugely underappreciated, both as president, certainly as an ex-president. And, when I say that, I think people sort of roll their eyes often. But, you know, he was somebody who really helped solve some long-term problems, some impossible problems, from the Camp David agreement that brought the Israel-Egypt peace to fruition, dealing with the Panama Canal, bringing human rights into politics. And then after that, he likewise took on some of these global health challenges. And I've just seen the progress that he made. River blindness was endemic around the world, and he reduced it by, I don't know, 98% or something. He used to tell me late in his life that he wanted to kill off guinea worm disease before he died.
Yeah, he wanted to outlive the last guinea worm.
Yeah, and he didn't quite make it, but again, guinea worm is this terrible parasite and disease, and he dramatically reduced it. So, I have a lot of respect for that kind of vision and determination that he showed. And Robert Kennedy, I should not junior, but the original. What I really admired about him was not only his extraordinary eloquence at all, but partly his capacity to grow. If you think about where he was in the 1950s and some of the things he said and did versus where he was by 1968, boy, that is an ability to change your position, to grow. And in particular, he had a remarkable capacity to listen to people and to engage with people who were in poverty without being condescending. And I think that's one of the problems that my world of liberals has today, that too often we come across as condescending to working class Americans. And Kennedy did not. And he, more than anybody, really tried to knit together the black and white working class in the mid and late 1960s. And if he had accomplished that, if he had succeeded in that, I think we'd be in a different political world today.
Place. And also, as you mentioned in his book, he called on Americans to be better than bigger and better than they thought they could be, which is something to be inspired. We are in a difficult time now. There are Ukraine, of course, is under tremendous attack daily, and as is Gaza. And you write about those in your column, but you continue to talk about Darfur, because Sudan and Darfur, that civil war, horrible civil war, has been going on for several years, and it's now been overshadowed in the press, I think, by the other two that I just mentioned. Do you want to talk about what's going on in Sudan, and how can individuals who are listening get involved and help?
Yeah, I mean, Sudan, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, the what's going on in both Gaza and Ukraine is horrific. And I write about those regularly, but Sudan has been completely overshadowed and is getting very little attention and a lot fewer resources, and it is facing multiple famines in various parts of Sudan. And the United States, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, has said that there is genocide going on. Right now, a militia called the RSF appears to be taking over a big city called El Fasher in Darfur. And when the RSF has taken over other major cities, it has engaged in mass murder and mass rape. And there is, deep alarm that the same thing is going to happen to countless thousands of people in El Fasher. In terms of what people can do, at a political level, the backer of the RSF is the United Arab Emirates. And I think that if there were U.S. pressure on the UAE, I think the UAE would back off. I think it would put more pressure on the RSF not to commit these atrocities. So I'd like to see more calls to the UAE embassy, more calls on American members of Congress to put pressure on the UAE. And if people want to donate, there's a remarkable grassroots effort within Sudan called the Emergency Response Rooms, the ERRs. And I think the website for it may be Mutual Aid Sudan. So they're,
Yeah, that's helpful. I think people do sometimes feel helpless at the scope of these, both the distance and the scope of these conflicts. One of the things you have done, which is a little out of the ordinary for columnists at a major newspaper, is you have come forward and periodically listed charities that you feel are making a real difference, and people trust you, and that's a big support for those charities. So was that a difficult, was the Times okay with that? I assume they were, since they let you do it, but
they were initially they were a little bit, I think, a little bit horrified and rolling their eyes, but readers, readers liked the idea, and they trusted the Times. They at the end of the year, they wanted to make a donation, but they didn't know quite who would be good to give to. And so, I did my first giving guide, and there was a really strong positive reaction, raised a lot of money. Now it's raising more than $10 million a year. And that, I think now the Times is completely fine with that.
I do want to ask you this. In this climate, which has now been going on for years, where the media is just splintered and balderized into 1,000 different parts, Walter Cronkite is long gone. The New York Times is still a voice for millions, but when we look at the media today, when you look at the media after all of the years you've been there, what can the media do to try and bridge the gaps and continue to bring the truth and try and bring people together?
So it's a great question, Louis. It's one I wonder about a lot. And a starting point is that we have to be watchdogs, not lapdogs. But that also means we have to do what we can to encourage transparency and to build trust. And there can sometimes be a tension between those goals. And when we write aggressively about an administration, then there will be a lot of folks who will tune us out instinctively. But at the end of the day, we have to be aggressive in covering the as best we understand it, and risk libel suits and risk other challenges. And in the long run, I think that is indeed what will both preserve the business model of journalism and also fulfills our role in the political system. But it is a really difficult, challenging time in journalism right now, both because of the trust issue and because so many newspapers are going out of business and it's expensive to cover these things. I hope people will support their local news organizations. The Times is going to be around, but we also need local papers and news organizations around the country.
I want to thank you. We could talk for another hour or two, but I think we'll have to stop now. But I do want people to know that this book, Chasing Hope, is a remarkable book, not just about Nicholas Kristof's life, which indeed has been remarkable, but about all of the events and places that he's covered. It's a real education, and it's beautifully written, and it's now out in paperback. So, Mr. Kristof, thank you for writing. Keep writing the stories you're writing. It's so important. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Louis. It was really my pleasure.
And please join us next time on Meet the Author. Thank you.